slow is steady and steady is fast. And that's really what you want to aim for. The worst thing you can do is go fast, make a bunch of decisions that are irreversible, not know where you went wrong, and are in a state of complete confusion.
Hello, friends. It's your host, Jess, and welcome to At the Edges of Coordination. Coordination around shared principles is the unifying through line for DAOs and community-owned networks. In Web3, we refer to shared decision-making as governance, which suggests something elaborate and overly orchestrated, but does it have to be? Join us in our new mini-series where we chat with 4 of the top coordination thinkers and practitioners in the DAO ecosystem. Peter, welcome to Club.
It's a pleasure.
Really stoked to jump into this conversation with you. And, as we were talking before, I was sort of thinking back to the first time we met as maybe a good way of getting into your history. And the first time we met was in Berlin in 2019, though I think we talked a bunch before then. And I remember walking into this lovely venue in Berlin and seeing you herding cats, basically, for the very first Metacartel demo day. I very distinctly remember this lowly Keurig coffee pot that was there serving the 200 or so members that were there. So the chaos, the excitement, the vibes there at the end of the sort of middle of the bear market were it was just a very fond memory. So maybe my way of saying Peter, an OG in the DAO space, and really excited to jump into this conversation with you.
Yeah, that was a fun event. We were getting quotes from How to Get Coffee. That was like an afterthought. That was like the first time running like any sort of conference-like thing. Yeah, Lily was organizing the food and drinks and stuff. And yeah, she was like $5,000, 5,000 euros for fucking coffee. Are you kidding me? No, we're ordering a coffee machine for like 150 euros and we're buying $100 worth of coffee pods. And then we're just serving everyone pre-made coffee through a machine.
I love it. I mean, it's sort of like I think for so many folks coming through their first market cycle, you can kind of see like the tops and the bottoms and sort of like the change in vibes. And I think, this idea of like bear markets for builders just seemed like maybe off the cuff remark, but truly like so many of the best relationships that I've built were at things like, Metacartel demo day. And I think I can trace so much of like the insight or at least the early connections for Seed Club to those sort of smaller pockets of true believers. And so I think the first time I came into contact with you was through the idea of Metacartel. Maybe if we could just give people a brief introduction on who you are, what you're doing right now, and maybe some of those early days.
Yeah, I think back in 2018, the thesis in the space was UX will come in and solve everything. Right. And I think we created this working group that worked on meta transactions. For those who don't know, it's like a transaction where a user doesn't pay for gas. It's abstracted by a third party. But after working on that and solving a lot of problems, we were like, who the fuck are we building this for? And I think quickly the group realized that hey, we actually need to build use cases that are compelling, that are Web3 native, not just supply chain on the block, supply chain blockchain bullshit, and yeah, that we sort of became a group that went and sort of built this community focus and just end user applications. Our whole message was like, stop focusing on low level infrastructure. We need to figure out use cases. Well, not stop, but we need to focus on use cases. Every Sunday, I would go through a DAC radar and list of applications listed, and I would use them, all of them, every Sunday. That's how little it was. And I wrote about it. And it was just looking at everything and realizing, yeah, that was what we needed to head into. And I think that was unique because we presented a different message saying, we care about end users. We care about end user value. Let's figure out use cases. Let's experiment really quickly. Let's be scrappy. Let's iterate. Let's be fast. Let's move quickly. And yeah, and we had a dancing chili as a logo, of course, right? So that's what sort of made it unique. And we experimented with different DAOs as well back in 2019 and really enjoyed the process of bootstrapping all of this. And we sort of incubated things like Zappa, Collabland, or early, incubated and helped and support from grant stage, right? Like Zappa, Collabland, Catalog, even gave a grant to Andre, and then he just went off the face of the planet before coming back and doing Yearn. Yeah, really interesting projects. Gelato Network, fascinating stuff. And yeah, I really enjoyed this process of supporting these projects. And I feel like through grants, I learned how early stage investing worked, at least not the investing bit, but understanding how real innovation happens and emerges, right? I was going through every hackathon applicant, sort of a hackathon submission, going through all that and supporting the journeys. And that sort of led me to 1KX where, liked doing this. So I wanted to go full time and make this my day to day, and been with 1KX for 2 years. And I would say 1KX is special because we really believe that Web3 native mental models will really revolutionize all aspects of our world, from gaming to low level infrastructure to data availability to social tokens and tokenized communities, music, everything, every area in which we see distributed ownership models really revolutionizing incentives and ownership structures.
So I think you sort of have like this really interesting seat where you both have, really early experience in building some of the early DAOs, right? Metacartels, the grants giving DAO was very novel in that it was very active and a thing and building on Mulak, so there's this sort of like hands-on deep experience with both like the benefits and of course like the challenges that kind of come from that. And then in moving into 1KX, you're sort of sitting at a table where you're involved in an incredible portfolio of projects where you sort of get to see those benefits and challenges applied in many different ways. And so what's exciting for me about this conversation is getting to tap into both the longevity and the sort of the insights that I think have been generated over time, but then also like the breadth that can come from it. Because I think it's very easy for folks to, it's hard to sort of understand the full breadth of what's being built in this space generally. It's probably impossible right now, a big difference from, say, 2 years ago. But the value of at least being able to tap into that insight is that there's so many lessons. You can sort of see patterns, and you can also see sort of like the right or left turns that are kind of maybe interesting to continue to pull on. So that's really where I want to get to with this conversation. The question's maybe very deceptively simple, but very difficult to answer. And maybe we'll kick it off here is, what's a DAO for?
It's a great question. I sort of see it as a social and economic coordination layer. So people sort of see it as a container for activity, which it is, but I see it as like really a simple, it's a set of like, social contracts and economic contracts that enable collaboration and trust, business and economic activity to be like sort of very high level broad, right? That wouldn't really exist. And I think the difference between sort of a business entity with a DAO, right, is really the fact that DAOs are a lot more programmatic and a lot more flexible and more nuanced in its ability to reflect ownership and I guess like reflect incentives as well. In terms of incentives and ownership structures, you have a lot more affordances at play, right? Like possibilities for design that wouldn't really traditionally be possible with just like rigid structures based on just pure paperwork, honestly. Like it's just pure paperwork until it's all settled in price funding rounds or IPOs. Really, these are the various real milestone checkpoints of a traditional equity business entity, right? So, and I think that you can sort of apply this distributed ownership structure and these tokenized incentives across all these industries in which there are sort of traditionally middlemen that everyone depends on. But because they depend on them, like ruthlessly like value capturing and monetizing at the cost of the network around them, right? And I think the idea of a DAO is, the idea that you can take much more flexible, much more fair sort of attribution value structures and apply them in which everyone wins. And because everyone wins, you're able to aggregate the best participants of a network and aggregate even more participants and aggregate more resources, either supply side and demand side, right? Through a shared, sort of, I guess, token.
I love that answer. And I think it gets at a bunch of the nuance here that is maybe built on a lot of the experience you've had. And so I'm curious if we sort of go back to the early days, 2018, 2019, Metacartel and what you're working on there. I'm wondering what like the initial thesis or intent or principles that were being built with back then. And I'm curious to see if those sort of sustain today, if there was any big lessons that were learned in those days versus where we are today.
I really honestly didn't care about decentralization, not decentralization, but decentralized coordination and organizations until I would say Moloch, even slightly, right? So I think Moloch DAO, for those who don't know, was really the first DAO that launched after the DAO itself, like after the DAO hack, right? That really inspired everyone, made DAOs cool again. So the funny story is that James Young, another sort of co-creator of Metacartel DAO and Metacartel as an ecosystem, right, really was trying to push me to look at Moloch DAO before it was launched. Kept on saying a bunch of stuff. I'm someone who like filters out 90% of the words people generally throw at me. If it doesn't make sense to me, I'll just like not get it, right? So this is one of the cases. I only really started paying attention when Moloch launched because it was able to do something that no one was able to really do elsewhere. What Moloch did was it pulled funds from about 20 to 30 people initially with 100 ETH commitments to really come together to fund Ethereum public goods. And back then, the only source of funding for Ethereum public goods was the Ethereum Foundation, which, as much as the great work they've done, they are generally slower to pull funding out of. As someone who was really working in public goods and UX infrastructure in 2018, that was a source of frustration. I wanted to fund public goods and see the really great projects that's funded regardless of the economic outcome, right? And I saw Moloch really instantly funding things permissionlessly. And I realized that Moloch, without the Moloch structure in which you can it's a DAO structure, but the key point is that you can put your funds in and also rage quit, leave at any time. with your pro rata share funds. And I realized that was a structure that made a group of people that didn't really trust each other too much. Amin was a summoner and you rally everyone to come together. But even then, no one really knew each other to come form an organization to fund things together. And I realized that was like initial reckoning moment of like, wow, this is actually super powerful. And I sort of didn't think too much beyond that. I was like, I want to do this, but with the application layer. We was like really struggling to raise. I guess we try to get like a UX, open source UX, like sort of software foundation off the ground. That didn't really work out. We try to get a DApp, right? Or decentralized application accelerator and incubator off the ground. No one knew who the fuck we were. Absolutely no way of getting that off the ground and raising funds for it. No money from investments, no money in the space in general for apps back then, no track record. But I was like, hey, let's like do a grants DAO. And I was like, let's do the same thing they did, but with us. And that was the inspiration for Metacostal DAO. And I think, honestly, I didn't really think too much about DAOs. I didn't really form a thesis beyond realizing just like what they could meaningfully make an impact with in the next 3-6 months. There's a ton of like sort of thought leaders around DAOs and shit out there, but I would say I'm much more of a pragmatist. How can, decentralized structure make an impact on what you're working with 3 months out, 6 months out, a year, rather than thinking like very open sky, big picture from day one, right? So initially it was just to get funding pulled together from different parties. And then we started giving out grants, funding apps. But then I think people started wanting to experiment with DAOs. And I was like, I'm not sure if the use case is really or not, but let's do it anyways to please some DAO members. And I think that's when we really started going down the rabbit hole of like, hey, what are DAOs? What can DAOs be like in the next 6 months? Where can they go? And I think we really expressed our questions through the grants and the projects we funded. We were like, could we build a DAO launchpad? There was Aragon and DAOsec back then, but there wasn't one for Moloch DAOs, which was getting sort of traction. So we built DAO House, right? We built things like Orochi DAO, summoned by Makoto from Kickback, shout out. He wanted to create, I guess, a DAO to initially come together to fund event sponsorships together. So it was like literally like 10, 15 projects coming together, pulling several $100, or maybe like a couple $100, nearly $1,000, maybe more, slightly more, to just like fund sponsorships together. And I think that quickly devolved into more of a DAO funding whiskey parties and spending all the money on booze in one go. But we were like doing things like, could we create DAOs for services organization? That became Raid Guild, a services DAO. And then, at the later end of 2019, when we like funded a bunch of applications and realized that we were really amassing a great community of builders and attracting great builders, we really started questioning like, how do we like commercialize this grants program that's been funding a lot of cool stuff like Gelato Network. We funded things like RDI. It was like the first idea where we're like, let's tokenize the revenue from interest earned of like, a savings position in Compound or Aave, and like, let's direct it elsewhere. Like we're funding things like that. That became super fluid. Yeah. And let's like fund DAO operations tools. Collabland, everyone knows this token gating, but it was really just like a Telegram bot that queried people on the sentiment of different grants, whether they're excited or not, right? That has like, 40,000 active Discord communities now. It's like just wild to see James Young and like that project go the length, right? The distance. We did a bunch of other stuff, but yeah, Metacostal Ventures was born out of that sort of traction and belief, right? And back then still, there wasn't any investor that was focusing on the application layer. And we wanted Metacostal Ventures to be, I guess, the first investor or community to come together to do focus on that, right? Yeah, right out of the gates, we launched in early 2020, raising only $400,000 from 30 odd people, putting in checks from $2,000 to $35,000 to $50,000, $70,000, right? So it's like today they'd be angel checks, right? But that's all we could scrummage up. And the grant sale was barely $100,000 as well. And so we tried what we could. And I sort of saw DAOs as a means to an end for very tactical objectives to push the application space forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of insight in that story there. I love thinking back, like just the amounts of money that was being played with back at that time compared to right now is just like, I mean, both like just crazy to see the growth in the space, but also there's so much value coming out of that sort of scrappy bootstrapper builder network. And it allows folks to not have to have this big overarching world changing thesis, but instead to say, okay, what are the tools, the things that we need to go do? How can these things be useful? And from starting at that place, I think you get to new novel ideas versus starting from sort of the idealistic or like the big vision that's going to get the VC check in the door. To me, that's like, as we see lots of deals come through our world, looking at folks playing the narrative to get the money versus folks that are like, I have this problem and I need to go solve it. Like it's a pretty stark difference between where I think in the future you'll see like a very big difference in where the latter ends up versus the former. The two trends that I sort of see in your story there are this idea of sort of social capital and financial capital. Like the value of being a part of Metacartel in the early days was not because you're going to go 10x your money. It was because you get to go A, have an impact, and B, you're a part of this amazing group of people who share the similar values. And the focus on that early on actually positioned you to be in a position to actually create financial value in the future. And I think like the trying to flip that around both sounded like very impractical in the approach you're trying to take, but also it probably wouldn't have ended up in the same sort of brand and notoriety and impact that you're having right now.
Yeah, definitely. We all lost money. We spent like our own money on experiments. And in hindsight, I realized that it's like you don't actually need a ton of capital to really experiment and explore the idea maze. The community worked because the community was needed. I think people think communities are just like set up a Discord and you like throw some events and Twitter spaces, you have a community. No, like communities become special when they're needed, when there's no one else coming together. And that's what makes a community special and powerful, right? And that's why you achieve things that you can't do alone. And yeah, like similar to C Club, like Metaculture was sort of like running experiments with like $1,000 to $5,000 grants. Meanwhile, not to diss, but like DAOsec had like 20 million or something back then. Aragon had $50 million. And we had less than around $100,000, right? And we just experimented a lot more. We learned a lot more during that period. And that was a stark contrast. And I take that, that's at the very core of like a fundamental belief of what I take to investing is sort of got like a special front row seat to how real innovation happens, right? And innovation always happens, whether social or technological, they're always preceded, right, by vibrant, vision-driven, mission-driven, values-driven communities that are iterating quickly, often, and sometimes sporadically as well. And that's needed. Experimenting in a way that is non-linear, to trying things. The Metacultural Demo Day, we used NFTs for the first time ever in crypto as tickets for conference tickets. Why the fuck not? So like that was the question. And I think to innovate, you sort of need to like run these experiments and say, why the fuck not? And you don't need a lot of money to do these small experiments, only like dedication and a vision, right? So that's what I saw with C Club. When C Club emerged, I was like, okay, like all these smart people are coming around to support the community, to create this community to support you as well. But I felt like that was a special moment. I was like, okay, 12 to 18 months from now, very special things will come out of this. And that's been a heuristic I followed in all of the space. Matchbox DAO, Molecule, Matchbox for like on-chain gaming, Molecule for DeSci, YGG for gaming, many others to list, honestly. But you have these like mafias that, or DAOs, if you will, that emerge and sort of collectively explore the idea maze. And I'm like privileged to like just had grinded and I guess like, eaten some shit, to be honest, through those days just to like learn play by play, inch by inch, what that looks like on a very microscopic scale.
Yeah, so I think the conversation here is sort of framed around DAO governance, or at least a part of the series that we're doing. But I think that insight there is actually truly an important insight for governance, because I think a lot of the time we start thinking about the management or decision making of these organizations after the fact, or at least as like a separate part to the founding or creation. And I think a through line through all these organizations is this idea of trust and social capital, and that there's definitely this trustless base layer that we're building on that sort of enables some social coordination to scale. But there's still this immense amount of, I think your description of DAOs early on was sort of this idea of it being this sort of social layer that exists there. In just sort of hearing your answer to the sort of last question, it seems to me that like getting that early part right is probably a bigger part of getting governance right than running the right template or mechanism or proposal format. You have thoughts on that?
This is a great question. I think that I would say that there's two spectrums and two things to balance, right? I think you need open source creativity of a community to really, explore idea mazes properly, to have that energy, to create an ecosystem, right, out of nothing. But I also see that the other side, where, governance really fails when you don't have like a clear vision, an understanding of what people are coming together to build. When you give a decision and when you give strategy, right, strategy is really a set of optimizations and trade-offs that you make. It's why you do X over Z and Y, right? And those need to be harsh trade-offs. Like a strategy is not a good strategy or powerful one if you don't at least somehow feel some little pain over the optimizations or prioritizations that you've made. And when you give that to a group of 80 to 200 people or more, you're going to end up with a shit show, right? So there's two sides, right? I think for DAOs to really work, I think you need to have a clear understanding of what you're trying to build And you need to also understand the game that you're playing. I think, for Index Corp, for example, as an example of a DAO, they weren't sure what they were, right? Were they, a business that served methodologists, like strategists that had unique index ideas, or were they going to be a product house, a product incubation house that built indices in-house, right? And I think there was this sort of confusion and clash between these two models, and thus more sort of confusion around governance as a result of not understanding the market well enough. And I think when you don't understand the market well enough, you're just spending money, right? And spending resources, allocating resources with no fucking clue what you're doing. And not to point Index example, but that was more of a decisional point, right? A pivotal point, which it had to make. And I would say most DAOs in the space haven't found that clarity of what they want to become, what is long-term sustainable, what makes sense, what can be repeatable. And this is stuff that like really is done traditionally by a CEO, CTO, head of product, right? And that, these are tough questions that take years to solve. Oftentimes projects need to find product market fit or find out repeatable revenue models that scale long term before they really want to scale and productionize what they have. But then there's the other side, which is like when you're building a token network or you're finding a model for a token network, you can't just build a community from scratch. Like, oh, we have a token network model, let's build a community. No, it takes years to do that. So it's about balance, and you need to have to build up context within that group, have them involved to some extent or to a great extent, depending on where you are at. But, you have these two needs clashing and really conflicting. And that's where the lack of delineation between the two, I think, or at least clear expectation setting for different operating models fall out with each other. And that's where you end up with kumbaya DAOs, right? Where I remember it was on the C Club podcast that I sort of really coined the term kumbaya DAO, and I've just been using it. It's like I'm trying to make it a meme. I'm trying to make it a thing, Jess. It's this idea of these DAOs just holding hands, saying everything's great, holding AMAs, doing everything but finding product market fit and finding sustainable business models, or just finding not even business models, even just or building efficient processes for building and exploring a product development or other means of sustaining themselves, right? And they're just lost in trying to be friends with each other. Originally, I've been on the far end of the spectrum of communities are about vibes. Yes, they are. I still believe in that. But having realized the actual numbers, and the reality and the outcomes of what kumbaya DAOs lead to, I've realized that, DAOs are places where you come together to get shit done. You can be friends and you can have those circles that you sit on the grass and hold hands with, but you're here to achieve something. You're here to make impact. And if you don't care about that, or you're not working towards that, you're not going to make it, basically, right? And I think that's what kumbaya DAOs are. As much as they talk about vibes and the mission and vision of what they're trying to do, they get lost and they lose sight of what they're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I think that's very much a product of the market cycle that we were in there, and it sort of allowed folks to avoid the tough questions. And I totally agree. This idea of what's more important, it's thing existing into the future or holding on to ideological or memes of the day, which I think, I agree. Vibes are maybe more of a means to an end than an end themselves, though. That's obviously, there's edge cases there as well.
To your point, I think people are prioritizing their own ideologies and their own egos over actual impacts. You're supposed to identify what you want to achieve. And once you've found a way to get there, ideology and law and everything around it is a means of scaling the social capital and social fabric of the community to get there more efficiently. It's not supposed to be a barrier. For Metacartel DAO, the grant sale, it was a simpler DAO. It's a lot more basic, but I think the example is I just knew that if we experimented with enough grants, collected enough builders together, we would succeed and discover really cool use cases. That's it. Nothing else, nothing more. It's just $100,000 grant sale, not meant to be anything more, right? And the culture was then sort of cultivated and designed around maximizing that. A lot of communities are they want to feel good. And it's there's an investor, a sharkish sort of investor term of, do you want to feel like you're right, or do you want to feel smart, or do you want to make money? I think the DAO version is do you want to be friends with people, or do you want to create impact? Something to that line. I don't know.
No, I like it. Hot takes. I like it. So the framing that I shared with you earlier for this conversation, it's sort of based on a number of conversations we've had offline over recent months. It's sort of where do DAOs go wrong, or what do we get wrong in governance? And I think this piece around strategy is actually really, really important, and maybe highlight some of the main friction, which you sort of expanded upon there a little bit. I'm curious, if if you think about like how organizations work really well, it's a vision, it's objectives that are moving towards that vision. There's measurables to ensure that we're actually moving towards that vision. And the mechanisms for doing that, are, I think, popularized in corporations, but there's insights from that and hard lessons learned that I think really need to be applied to DAOs as well. I'm curious, like the method of being able to get clear on strategy in a DAO, I think it's a pretty big open design space. And there's extremes, right? One is like, maybe let's call it Kumbaya DAO. And we can say it's maybe efficient or effective once in a while, but probably generally not effective. And then the other is maybe, corporation founding with a CEO. They have a big vision. They're going to go build all the things and the products and sort of launch it and then sort of exit to community, et cetera. Is there a middle ground there? Or are you sort of suggesting that like the right way is to actually really lean into that small team and clear leadership?
It's funny that everyone's trying to build onboarding tools, but no one's trying to build strategy forming tools or product clarity tools or whatever the fuck that looks like. Honestly, it's like most DAOs, 99% of all DAOs in the space just haven't found long-term strategic clarity and understanding. And yet they're onboarding more and more chefs of the kitchen, DAO onboarding. Let's bring on more members. Yeah. Let's sing songs and let's spend more money, hire everyone, right? And in the interim, while we are missing a lot of maybe like the DAO native or community-centric like strategy or formation docs, maybe the methodologies, like traditional product leadership methodologies that exist in traditional startups, I think it's more about just like going slower. You don't need like, if you can't figure out how to effectively leverage and deploy 5 DAO contributors effectively to work towards a coherent vision and strategy, you're not going to be able to do it with 30. And so it's just like stepping down, like moving a lot slower, right? And way slower, like 10x slower than what people think they should be moving at. And I think building a DAO and introducing more members and more contributors is one thing, but then I think people mistake it for building a community. There are areas in which you can open source the community and get involvement and participation, but there is a level in which you do need to curate out very loud voices that don't do very much, right? And just get shit done. It's like get shit done tools are like going to be big. You probably have heard of them. It's called Google Docs, Google Calendar, Gmail, and Trello, and maybe more crypto native tools will emerge, right? Like Snapchat is a great one. Notice to safe, they fade into the background, right? I definitely have some PTSD here.
I think that image of sort of like, adding more and more cooks to the kitchen, like if you sort of made that very clear to builders that are really focused on DAO, I totally agree. It's very much, if you're building the space, that is not the challenge you have. The challenge you have is how do we put people to useful work? And I think the mechanisms we're using right now are grossly inefficient and ineffective. And I think to your point, maybe even detrimental to the ultimate goals teams have. And I think, we've experienced this within C Club, like the working group structures that we have rolled out have been successful to some degree, not successful to other degrees, but really the lessons learned there where people want to be effective. People want to be good at their jobs, and without structure around that so that people know where they want to be, where they go or should be going, what the outcomes are driving towards are, it's very, very difficult for people to actually feel comfortable and bring their full selves to do it. And so instead of being in this place where we're actually unlocking this hive mind of human potential, and you end up in this sort of muddy, messy, sort of uncomfortable space for most people who feel like they're not being effective and aren't actually driving towards the outcomes they're trying to drive to. So the lesson that we've internalized here is like decentralization, but not structurelessness, and a focus on structure. And I think you even use a term that I've been using a lot, which is like you said, most DAOs or people in DAOs don't understand the game they're playing. And I'm curious, I totally agree with that. And sort of one of the theses that I have coming out of that is that our job as sort of people who are tasked with standing up these networks is about not only defining those games, but building the rules and the structures of those games. And that for us to actually be able to tap into that next level, there's just such a massive difference between, and a huge gap in information. So information asymmetry is just the biggest challenge. People can't keep up with all these things, and yet we're asking folks to come in and vote on very, very important subjects. Index co-op, I'm a token holder. I see all the proposals. I do not have remotely enough context to make any meaningful decision there. So curious, like when we think about the games to play here or to design, have you seen good examples of that, or am I on the right track here?
Yeah, no, I think you're on the right track. I definitely resonate there. Yeah, people are building incomplete games. It's like, imagine there was a game in which you could like only drive one car in a little city, and then you like never designed like the monetary system. Like imagine Uber was like a video game, and people like, you never designed the actual system to make money. You just like had a little car that people drove around, and you're like, everyone just jumps in the world and does the same thing. Like people tend to copy, right? Most contributors will be followers to what you've done. Whatever you've done, people are going to do over and over again. So you need to be careful about what you're letting people into, what type of game you're letting people into, right? They're just going to repeat the same thing over and over again, to better for worse. And it can be a powerful thing because if you built the right models, it's a beautiful system that can flow. And I think one of the best DAOs I've seen out there is definitely Code Arena. People who don't know, a Code Arena is a DAO that facilitates code audits. What they do is they run audits for code. Typically, they're done by private auditing firms. And effectively, they have a gamified system where people review code and they put up exploits or bugs that they find. And it's ranked and it's scored based on the severity of the bugs found. And there's wardens who are curating those. And they have an amazing system that flows super well. And I think maybe it's security engineers who are non-political, but it just fucking works and just scales. It's something that it has done incredibly well. And that gives me hope that, other DAOs definitely able to design similarly effective systems, right? But I think that for code auditing, I think the key there is that the game loop of auditing code is a lot more straightforward and it's simpler. But I think it proves out that these complete loops can be built. I think that product development and idea maze navigating and strategy building, these are extremely, extremely complex loops. The question is how do you build a game for that, right? And I think that's why all these DAOs have completely struggled, is that first thing is that many DAOs don't have the right people who are capable enough of actually formulating and working on those things. So you're just having people who aren't fit for the build step up in very senior and high stakes decisions, right? Without the right background capabilities, as well as without the right skin in the game as well. And then secondly, by itself, it's just hard. And then to not even have properly designed sort of game loop for that, it just becomes chaos. And I think that's the part of the tension between figuring things out and then building a community that is following the journey and collaborating with you, right? And I think the middle ground is building DAOs with governance constraints and evolving towards governance minimization as you figure out what works. But the key in the beginning, I think, with governance is not to have it open-ended, do whatever you want. When you haven't figured things out, it's more about slowly opening up the scope. And then it's not about opening it up to whatever is game. It may be, yes, long-term for most DAOs because they are self-sovereign communities with tokenized governance. Zeroing in on what matters. That is the end goal. Doing whatever you want is not the end goal. That is the failure mode for DAOs. It's when it doesn't know what it should be doing and what it shouldn't be doing. That's sort of the challenge, I think.
That's super interesting because I think there is a very fundamental difference in belief system or idea. The value of crypto and Web3 generally is the power of the meme and the WAGME. And that's very, very, I think, important in sort of breaking through into the more mass attention. And also in this conversation, it's just very, very clear that, if we see DAOs as products, which I believe we need to look at them as products for building these networks, that there isn't a very good process for finding product market fit for those things. And it's complicated by the fact that, depending on how you structure your organization, you can kind of have a ton more noise than signal in it. And so I think separating these two things out, though, I think there's a danger in just solely using this model, but separating it out between sort of those building the network and those participating in the value creation of the network as being very separate both phases and maybe teams and personalities or talent pools. I think the lesson is just very important to say that those can be separate and maybe should be separate and obviously supportive of each other, but trying to do both of those at the same time. Because I think that the challenge when we talk about this idea of governance, which is maybe it's sort of decision making, it's over what? And the failure mode, as you said, is sort of over a whole lot of nothing. And what really people want to be a part of is something that's successful and that has impact, that creates financial and social impact. The models we're using right now are really, truly not supportive of that because of this failure of being able to get clear, to do the hard work, make the decisions, to say no to things, which I think is just the biggest challenge in this space generally. It's very, very easy to say yes, and it's very, very hard to say no.
Yeah, there's a saying where it's there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. I think passports were a temporary government program, and now, holy shit, it's just everywhere. It's you can't get rid of
income tax in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, that's a marketplace transaction fee, right? But yeah, it's incredibly tough to fight that bias, to just do things and get out of patterns. Governments are the clear example of this bureaucracy. I think one thing that I was surprised is that I've managed to see government level bureaucracy at like 1,000-person level discords. It's like, I thought it was going to be easier, but it's actually like much harder. It's just as hard.
Okay, so there's a number of people listening to this podcast that are early in the formation of their DAOs or participating in their DAOs. And the issues that we're sort of talking about here are ones that are probably much easier solved up front and much harder to solve down the line, because so much of it is cultural and, you know, part of the meta game that we're trying to design for. What do you sort of see as like maybe just put your advice giving hat on, which I know you're very effective at. What should early builders be focused on today? What do we need to be thinking about building that will make the ultimate challenge of governance and decision making in a growing community much easier down the road?
I guess first, my whole tone has been very critical, but I think it's also like the context for this stuff is that everyone's trying to do stuff that's never been done before. That's like another added layer of complexity. So it's like the DAO space is eating shit right now, but I would say it's not necessarily anyone's fault. It's not like, we learn, we live, right? But like there are things that can be done a lot better, and parameters, right? It's not just like chaos happens out of nowhere. We are in total control of what happens. And we just need to dissect things more closely, right? So my advice is, if you're building a network, try to figure out as much of it out as you can without building a community yet, to be honest. I think there is a point in which you're going to need to get community involvement. But then there's that point in which there's a question of like, how big do you grow that community, or why do you build the contributor base? And I think my advice is like, figure out how to get stuff done with just 5 contributors effectively. If you're not happy with the efficiency and output of these 5 contributors, don't go any further. Figure this out. And then if things are working well, add another person, make it 6, make it 7, make it 8. One by one, get this from 5 to 50. And if you can hand curate this community, then you've probably then figured out the mappings of what works, the game, the design. And that's when I think you scale, right? Scale for tokenized incentives and effectively implement a protocol that coordinates everyone. But I think that this is a much later stage, end state, than what most DAOs think they are. And so my advice is start super small, start super slowly, make sure things work, ask why for everything and how it relates to the goals of the community or goals of the network that you're trying to build. If it doesn't have a direct impact, which is hard because people like to extrapolate. This is important because this achieves this and then that achieves that. If it doesn't have a direct correlation, and it's probably something to backlog, and you want to build super, super slowly, super carefully. Not to say slowly, but it often, there's another thing. I like, my quotations book is fucking mooning right now, in this podcast. But, like, it's a martial arts like saying where it's like slow is steady and steady is fast. And that's really what you want to aim for. The worst thing you can do is go fast, make a bunch of decisions that are irreversible, not know where you went wrong, and are in a state of complete confusion. Also in a position where you've given up all your power as well to fix and course correct. That's a real danger, right?
I think that's a very important thing to underlie. And I think there's an intuition that you can feel when you're building these things. And there's sort of like a decision that you maybe make that all of a sudden is out and kind of starts to run rampant, and you realize how easy it is to open things up and how hard it is to step back from those decisions. And when you feel that as a builder and you sort of feel the intensity and momentum and craziness, there's an excitement in it. That's a very different thing to start to emerge once you have a lot of the things figured out versus in day one.
Not to say that the impact of going wide and getting a lot of people involved is for naught. That creates a ton of energy, and that sometimes is needed. I guess like my point is like, these are all operating modes. Where we're going is like probably DAOs figuring out how to head into different operating modes. Maybe it's a governance minimized operating mode where it's wartime and it's a smaller group. Maybe it's peacetime and you want to go wide. You want to get a lot of participation in. And maybe that's like different levels of participation, different types of members, right? Or different operating modes, right? Even, right? It's like you have a save battery mode where you like maybe downsize and cut burn. The different states of community are all vehicles for different networks of leverage. It's just any one state is not likely to be the right state for long-term all the time. And that's where the nuance is. And I think if someone's a skilled enough community builder, they can balance and shift the community in between. But I think for most, if you've never built a community before, never built it on coordinated in a decentralized way, keep it simple, stupid. Walk before you can run. That stuff in which you're balancing and evolving and between operating modes, that's for sort of the people who've been surfing for 10 years and they're just like riding the waves. For others, you can achieve a lot by just being simple.
And I think like the challenge is that there hasn't been a lot of discernment around these operating modes that we're grabbing onto. And there is a lot of like what has worked before. And so I think to your earlier point, like the challenge is that this stuff hasn't been done before and there's going to be mistakes made, and that's good. That's how we find
Yes.
the edges of things. And so, I think this general theme of the work we do at C Club and this podcast is really about highlighting those things, trying to add more color to those decisions, not because obviously we're huge DAO bulls and community bulls and et cetera. But the number of people that really want to suggest is give me the framework. What is the token framework? What is the community building framework? And I refuse. I absolutely refuse because these things need to be built from not even first principles. There's like this primordial ooze that you're bathing in that these things need to emerge from, and no two projects emerge the same way. And there is a level of intuition and kismet that kind of exists in these things that if you try to just say, I'm going to copy this and bring it over, it's not going to work. And I think that's to our point earlier. I don't know if we were saying this before we started recording, but this idea of like Web 2, Web 2.5, Web 3, why I'm such a bull on Web 3 native organizations is because they are starting in this place. And yes, there are many reasons why it's going to be harder for people to use. And yes, it's going to be harder to manage, et cetera. But innovation is what creates value. People who are innovating in this new world, I think, are going to create the most value. The difficult thing is trying to understand when and where to apply those things. And it's more art than it is science, and will probably remain that way for a while. I mean, think about companies, right? There's a lot of great insights on how to go build companies, but you cannot go take the lean startup and all of a sudden expect you're going to have a successful company all the time.
These are all skills, right? I think people forget that decentralized coordination and community building are skills. Some people suck at it. Some people are beginners. Some people are much more experienced. Some people, I wouldn't say there's like another way of framing expert, or it's just like people learned a lot, right? And I think like for people to
Eat
really,
shit a lot.
eat shit a lot. And once you're at a skill level, you can sort of really try to do new things. Beginners, it's like imagine beginner Solidity engineer trying to build the world's most complex smart contract. That's what beginner decentralized coordinators are trying to do sometimes. And that experimentation really works sometimes. Not saying everyone needs upfront experience, but it explains for a lot of failures and a lot of struggle is that there's this like overzealous attempt to just like do too much without recognizing their own condition and their own capabilities.
I see myself in that statement. Future me, I see myself in different versions of that statement. I think that's sort of an ongoing process. We frame this conversation here in terms of governance, and yet everything we're talking about would not traditionally be considered governance, or at least in how people talk about governance. And I think that's really important, right? Because I think as we've got into more of a conversation here, both of us are coming from this perspective of like having hands in the dirt, trying to build these things. And what you start to recognize is it's not another technology tool. It's not a governance frame. These are not the things that are ultimately the biggest difference makers in the very least the earliest stages of these communities and DAO projects. So I think that's a pretty big insight. The next step of like, okay, well, how do we make that actionable, right? Because it is much easier to just say, I'm going to take this process or platform or tool off the shelf and it's going to solve my problems. But what we're suggesting here is that actually you kind of just need to go get punched in the face a bunch on your mission to the thing. We say we want to be on what's the big adventure that you're on, and adventures are filled with risk and excitement, and all of those things are essential to not only a personal journey, but also I think a group's journey. How do we advise people who want to step into the space to go and get useful experience? I feel like a lot of the advice is just go join another DAO, but my concern there is that you might learn the hard lessons, but you're not maybe learning the best practices or great ways of going about doing things.
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. Yeah, the join another DAO thing, I think I would send them to a horrible run DAO and like give them a heads up of like, go feel what it's like to like be in hell, like experience governance hell. I think what to do is fuzzy and yet to be properly understood, to be honest. But what not to do, yeah, we're forming solid data points there. So if someone wants to learn about this or build a DAO or tokenized community or build a token network, it's like start really small and iterate and experiment incrementally in ways in which you can identify what is success, what is failure, and then revert if possible. It's like software development, right? You write tests first of all to make sure the code works, but then you also have testing or staging where you launch a code in a testnet version effectively and you play with it. You see if it works actually. You type all the fields in, click every button, make every interaction on the website, sometimes automated, sometimes manual. And then if that works out, like you want to then formalize it, right? That's how you should be trying new things and experimenting. I think less copying what someone else looks like they're doing, and it seems to be temporarily working, maybe not actually knowing the numbers and just copying them. Yeah, that doesn't work, right? That's, you want to fork the GitHub of like, bootstrap to JS or something like that, and then start incrementing on the code line by line, the coordination rules, one line by line, the responsibilities one bit at a time, as opposed to just copying and pasting like an entire Stack Overflow piece of code and being like, yeah, this might work, TBD.
I often think about sort of launching token networks similar to like the user-generated content revolution or like Blogger launching, right? Like it went from this thing where the publishing of ideas was a very paper-driven big deal, right? Like there's resources getting put into it to something that anybody could do. And which I think is the case. I mean, it's very easy to go launch a token. It's very easy to launch an NFT, etc. In crypto, there's actually like still a lot of fear around making something that is immutable and therefore unable to be changed. And there's sort of like this actual barrier to that freedom of testing and experimentation that I think is so essential to the creative pursuits or innovation pursuits of many organizations. And so I think to me, that's maybe the advice that comes out of my brain here as my dogs are barking at the garbage man behind me. But this idea of like, it's not difficult to launch something as long as you're not putting ridiculous promises associated with it. Like go mint a token, go create some art, go bring a Telegram group together. Like these things are not, maybe they're not seen as like you're building a DAO that's going to raise, hundreds of millions of dollars, but that's where most of these really interesting things start, or at least the learning starts.
For sure. I would say the counter argument, every sort of maybe piece of advice has a counter, equally like valid counter. And I think the counter to what I just said is the fact that like new 0 to 1 ideas and structures and mechanisms aren't iterative. Like the nouns DAO community, for example, is not something that was iterated, but people did try it in I would arguably say, a low risk environment, right? Nothing was necessarily being risked. It started organically from day one and then picked up steam. And then maybe for other existing organizations with more at risk, obviously NounsDAO has a lot of risk right now. It's built up something very special, right? But for newer organizations, they may not be able to take those risks. But now there's a data point in which they can like learn from. So it's like a balance between like, if you have an idea and something, like go experiment with it, really do it, but like, really set the expectations properly, like you said, and then also understand, sort of how to like incrementally improve upon what's already existed, right? Not only on DAOs, but just organizational design and management in general.
Peter, I love that I have all these sort of questions that I furiously wrote out just before our call and that we didn't even get into, because I think the insights of like even just where the energy in this call went to was really around stuff that I think is absolutely foundational to the bigger challenges of governance, et cetera. And while this is maybe not the most useful thing for folks that are managing, huge protocol DAOs as well, I think the most exciting pieces for me, at least right now, are in the space of emergence and the new ideas that get created. And it's truly the insight that we had at C Club. Like, how do we go be pragmatists in the space and get more DAOs, not more tools into the world? And I think there's hard-earned lessons and deep thought here that's very apparent in sort of how you carry yourself in this conversation that I think is incredibly important. And I promise, dear listener, that it definitely chunks up into some of like the bigger, hairier decision-making governance type conversations or decisions that you'll have to make as you continue to build that success. But I think the through line I see here is like, we need to level up our talent and understanding our skills. We as leaders need to better understand the game we're playing, the things that we're building, and that getting that early culture and connective tissue right actually gives us a ton of optionality to get the other things right in the future. But if we don't do those first pieces, the likelihood of us being able to solve the bigger challenges as they emerge is a lot lower.
Yeah, I'm only generally being critical because I feel like no one's voicing that side of the narrative, right? But in reality, I'm a very centrist. I'm a true centrist in the sense that like both of these sides really matter. It's not all redundant. There is a reason why directionally people have gone where we've gone and explored where we've explored. But yeah, that's what makes it hard. It's not a black and white sort of reality.
Well, I think that's what makes conversations like this super valuable. Like there isn't a framework or bullet point list of things that will lead to your success. And I think this idea of being able to tap into these sense-making networks are, absolutely essential to being able to figure out these things. And, as the seat I sit in here at C Club trying to help navigate us through and into this uncertainty, there isn't a month period that goes by where I don't feel like something new has happened that might be existential in some way for C Club. And I think, being able to have conversations with folks like yourself and the broader network of C Club is just absolutely essential. So appreciate you taking time at the end of your day to come and share these thoughts. Glad that we could have you on as a repeat guest here. And I hope folks find this valuable in at least maybe resetting some of the base assumptions that maybe are going to solve some of the challenges they'll face should they be more successful in the future.
For sure. It was awesome chatting to you again. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you, sir.